Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. Today, I will be chatting with my good friend John Pearson, who calls himself a master, but not like what you may think. John calls himself a master of mistake making. I love that. Just a bit on John. John Pearson is a board governance and management consultant from San Clemente, California. He served more than 30 years as a nonprofit CEO, 25 of those years as the CEO of 3 national and international associations, including the Willow Creek Association and Christian Management Association, which is now known as Christian Leaders Alliance. John is also the author of 10 books on board governance and leadership development, with an emphasis on leadership at the highest levels in an organization. With that, let's welcome author, CEO, consultant, and nonprofit guru, John Pearson. John, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Thanks. You're referring to me, apparently.
Yeah, I knew you would do that. Say, where is this guy?
Great to be with you, and in person. To be with you in person. Amazing.
You know, this is our first in person in months. You know, with COVID, everything went remote. And so it is so fun to actually look at my friend, my guest, and we can read each other's eyes. John, you probably noticed in my opening comments, I introduced you as a good friend. Now, although we go back 30 years or so, 25, 30 years, it has been at least a decade since we have been together. But like all great friendships, once we connected, it was as if we had just had coffee a couple of days before. And perhaps I was thinking that may be the definition or a definition of a good friendship, and that time is just not a factor.
That's perfect. I felt the same way. And it's so fun to be with you.
Oh, it's great fun. Since the days we spent so much time together, you have become truly, and maybe guru is not the right word, but you have become a national name in the domain of Christian nonprofits, you're followed by thousands of people. You are extremely influential. I think our listeners might profit by a better understanding of what it is that you do. Kind of just off the top of your head, what does the guru of Christian nonprofits do with his time?
Well, I keep trying to retire. And
since 2018?
Since 2018. I was going to cut back 20% a year. Well, that didn't work. And so now I work kind of half days, but I do a lot of reading and reviewing leadership management books. And I still do some consulting on the side. In the work I did with these 3 associations, I would always do member customer surveys saying, what are your greatest needs that the association can provide? Perpetually, they would always come back and say, well, we need more money, and we're having problems with our boards. And so I started going especially into the board governance side, saying, well, what are the best practices, and why are there so many dysfunctional boards? And I talked to the smartest people I could, and then just kind of stole from them and started writing books with another friend, Dan Busby, and did a lot of workshops. And so over the years, in my consulting years after association leadership, I did a lot of consulting with boards. And sometimes the board chair would bring me in saying our CEO needs a kick in the rear. Sometimes the CEO would bring me in and saying our board needs a kick in the behind. And so it was a lot of fun. And the typical problem, Charlie, is that a lot of boards come to the board seat through their volunteer hat, and then they start...
they become an operating board. They become an operating board. Rather than a governing board.
And they deal with all the volunteer issues rather than the top vision type stuff that boards need to focus on.
And they walk into corporate offices without an appointment. And, it's not like the CEO doesn't have anything to do or the chief operating officer doesn't have anything to do. Their plates are filled. And the board member thinks, because I'm a board member, I can come in and I can start telling you how to operate. I have seen that movie several times, and both as staff and board member, and I'm really an advocate of governing boards that keep us mission straight, budget straight, audit of our activities, keep that straight at a high level, but operating needs to be in the operations people. I mean, they know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Tell me, you have also become now I love this, John. It's such a great title. You have become the self-proclaimed master of mistake making. I just, without getting into details, I'm looking high level. What is a master of mistake making?
Oh, my. Well, my wife, Joanne, who has noted most of my mistakes,
I must say, as I've done the reading, I'm realizing who wears the pants in the family.
Exactly. Oh, my. There's a spiritual gift of discernment. I don't have it. She does. So had I known that, I don't think I would have married her, because she's always right. But she saw all these books that I was reading, and I read and reviewed books in my association years, and then I started a little newsletter called Your Weekly Staff Meeting, where I review a book every week. And she said, "John, have you ever tried to connect those books to the mistakes you've made?"
Really? That was Joanne's idea?
That was Joanne, and that's a brilliant idea. So during COVID, now I just picked out 25 mistakes. My son Jason, who worked with me on the book, said, "Dad, you certainly had 100 to 200 you could have picked from." And I said,
well, of course. Well, who doesn't, though? But who doesn't, though, John? It's not just you. You're not unique.
Yeah. So the book, it's really a workbook, Charlie, Mastering Mistake Making. The concept is, here's a mistake I made, sometimes early in my career, but sometimes late in my career. And then here's a book I read later, and I hit my forehead and say, "Oh, if I had only read this book before, I wouldn't have made that mistake. Here's what I've learned." And readers, leaders, maybe if you read this book, maybe you can avoid the mistakes and kind of learn from me. So that's the concept. 25 mistakes, 25 books. And it's a workbook format, so you can take your team or your department, just pick off a mistake a week, have a different person facilitate a 10-minute discussion, and hopefully they'll get some value from my mistakes.
I think the discussion of mistakes themselves, I like your 25 mistakes, but all of us have so many others that we could incorporate that are particular to our board situation, or our because you're talking largely to leaders, and we are going to make that accessible to people who are not in necessarily leadership position, but how this impacts your life in general. And one thing about you, John, that is, I think it's very important to know, and we will talk about, because we're doing a 2-week show, and we will talk about next week more about how you manage your learning from it. But there's a key character quality that you excel at, and that is teachability. If you were not teachable, you're not going to learn from anything.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think somebody else has to notice that in people. When I have young men and women who say, "John, would you consider doing some coaching or mentoring for me?" That's the first thing I think of, Charlie. Is this person teachable?
Yeah. Absolutely, because it doesn't because they're looking for, as we will talk about later, they're looking for confirming feedback, saying they're okay, and here's how you can take your okay and make you even better, rather than saying your okay is really not okay. I like what Tim Timmons used to say. Remember the book You're Okay, I'm Okay?
Right,
a long time ago.
Right.
He didn't write a book, but he made a title that said, "I'm not okay, you're not okay, but that's okay."
That's perfect.
That's a very Tim Timmons.
I'm a collector of great book titles. I'll add that one.
Well, I've got a couple for you. Give us an overview of sort of the structure of your book, of Mastering Mistake Making, which is one of 10 books that you've written, and you write about 25 personal mistakes. And like you said, there's hundreds, thousands of mistakes that you could be listed. Why these, and why this process?
Yeah. Well, another book I wrote, 2008, Mastering the Management Buckets. I had to come up with 20 management buckets, and one of them was delegation. And I started going into the delegation literature, and I literally almost had to get on my knees and confess. Like I even after all those years, and I was leading the Christian Management Association, but I was a terrible delegator. But until I read the literature deeply, and then I realized, I could have done so much better. And I don't want other people to go through that pain. Well, the same way with mistake making. My wife suggests the book, and I thought that's a great idea. Well, then everything I read, I started with a little code. I read with a pen, and I would write a M with a little circle around it in the margin of the pages every time I saw a mistake that I could learn from. Not a typo. I'm so OCD, I do that also. But but when I saw a mistake, so even today, long after the book's been out, I wrote it in 2021, I'm still finding, this is a good concept. That needs to go in the book. So I started learning the value of mistake making, and a ton of people write about it.
I love that, the value of mistake making.
So I just divided the book into about, I don't know, about 5 chapters per section. Like the first one is reading, listening, and learning from the mistake-making literature. So and for me, I'd always been a reader, but really not a learner. I was just getting through the books, and I wasn't making it personal. I was reading too narrowly in just leadership and management. Then another one was Magic, Meatloaf, Murphy, and More Mistakes, Murphy's Law. And so I know
you're big on Murphy's Law.
I love Murphy's Law. Incessantly whining about being too busy was one of my mistakes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Then what did I learn from people like the theologian Francis Schaeffer or Clayton Christensen, who was at Harvard, who would do a class on doing well? Margaret Thatcher, Malcolm Gladwell. So all of a sudden, with this lens of mistakes, I started going back to these books and saying, oh my, I learned this and I wouldn't go back and do that again. Like your last guest, Jim Kyles, talked about, I just listened to it this morning, he talked about not making big decisions at night. He says, when you have more grace in the morning. I've never heard that before. So I hope I'm a lifelong learner, and I hope I'm still teachable. But so those are things. One of the big sections that just almost did me in was every leader needs a coach except me. If I look at my life with a coach in the later years and my life without a coach, it's just like, I'm
so agree. And and it's not just the leaders that need coaches. You know who else needs coaches? A coach.
Yeah.
Coaches need coaches.
Exactly.
And coaches it's almost irreverent for a coach not to have a coach.
Yeah.
And I have had in the last I would say I've always had sort of a mentor, but I had official coaches for maybe the last decade. And every one of my coaches are women.
Way to go.
And I was not gender biased when I went in to pick the coaches.
Yeah.
They were just the ones that knew the stuff.
Yeah.
And they were, one, it's more Christian. They were sympathetic to Christianity. They could understand it. They could work with me, but they didn't come from a Christian perspective. And so that leads me to another question that I was going to ask later. I had it later, but I think in the beginning of the podcast it would be really helpful for a lot of our listeners, because I think a great majority of our listeners are Christians or followers of Christ, or if not, they have some sort of religious ties.
Sure.
But there's a lot of people that are not. And so so I'm curious, is there a difference? Or there is a difference. What is the difference between Christian boards and Christian leaderships and regular and charity nonprofits that are out doing because we're in the nonprofit space.
Sure.
So charity non-Christian charity nonprofits.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in the management of that? Is there a different approach?
There should be. That's what I teach. There always isn't, because sometimes those who, maybe the person who's 50 who sells his or her company and says, I've always wanted to jump into this thing, and they start a nonprofit. They're good church attenders. They would say they have a deep belief in God, but their value system has been molded by more the workplace, more the money side than the value side. So for boards that say we are followers of Jesus, and so we look at the thing, well, what would Jesus do in this situation? So, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament, chapter 18, it talks about how you handle conflict. And there's a distinctively biblical approach. And conflict, I mean, Peter Drucker said, who was a Christ follower, said, you're going to have conflict. It's not if, it's when. And so you ought to have rules in your organization, protocols for how you handle conflict between one another. Well, the Bible, Scripture, gives an approach for how you deal with conflict. Go to the person one-on-one. If that doesn't work, you bring a second person with you. And it's all about not suing one another if it rises to an extreme level, but doing it in a God-honoring way.
Hopefully it's in the pursuit of clarity.
Yes.
And what's most helpful for the organization. I find personally a great integration between the two. And my experience has been the nonprofit charities that I have been associated with. I've not been a member of, but I've worked on and I've given to them that are not Christian oriented, are still very values oriented.
Oh, yeah.
They care about people and they care about...
And they do good stuff.
They do great stuff.
Another huge distinctive in the best ones are how do they raise money? What's their view of money? You'll see a lot of people saying, well, it's time in my life to give back. And that assumes that I'm the owner to start with. A Christ follower says, everything I have is God's. I'm the steward. I'm not the owner. And so
that's a good distinction.
So you take a steward mentality. So then when you're inviting people to give to your nonprofit, whether it's for homeless people or literature or whatever, am I using all the manipulative techniques of marathons and golfathons and auctions, silent auctions, etc., or am I just challenging people from a biblical perspective of saying, the money that you're stewards of, what has God placed on your heart? Where is your passion? You can't give to 25, 50 things. Can I help you figure out what God has called you to be part of, whether you time, talent, treasure, where you volunteer, where your money. So it's a whole different approach to inviting people to help fund the organization.
So I see a tremendous integration between the two.
Yes.
And that non-religious charities have at heart many of the same things that we do as Christian charities. Discover more about that as we get along. But thanks for that
great
clarity.
question. You ask great questions.
Scary questions. So I was thinking about how to format our discussion today, and I thought what I might like to do is take sort of a combination between a tactical and philosophical approach to mistake making, and my listeners will know I'm always going to take the philosophical approach.
Right.
Exactly. That's my comfort zone. What I think I'd like to do is tackle. I've identified 4 mistakes that I'd like to talk about today and next week. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the tactics of a mistake, and then we'll go through the philosophy of what do we learn and how can we then appropriate the learning to our everyday lives.
Sure.
So I'd like to begin with, and forgive me, I don't mean to change your titles. I'm not changing your titles. I'm taking it's actually written by you. It's not written by me, but I've just taken this because this was so meaningful to me, and it's a take on mistake number 16, and that is, I realize there was a question I wanted to ask before, but let's just go with this: the mistake of thinking other people think like me.
Oh my!
Now, I have added another one that is very popular in our culture, and that is thinking other people should think like me. So talk to me about thinking other people, the mistake or the fallacy of thinking other people think like me.
Well, that theme kind of runs through a couple of my mistakes, and it reminds me of a book that I learned an awful lot from. I can still remember where I was when Joanne read the book first, which is unusual because when I'm reading a book, I read some of the sections of her, and then I say, you need to read this book. She says, why? You've already read it to me. So, but it was one of the world's greatest coaches, Marshall Goldsmith.
Oh, of course, yes.
What got you here won't get you there. The 20 annoying habits that disrupt your workplace. And he says, you're not managing you. And one of the early insights I had on this, and Joanne and I are committed to each other for life. When I say it saved my marriage, it made our marriage much more pleasant. And that was that I learned the 4 social styles. And there's lots of systems out there, and I've done them all. I've taken all the assessments, but this one is so easy to remember for a guy like me. 4 social styles are driver, analytical, amiable, and expressive. And so whenever I'm in a group, I intuitively, because I've learned this, say that person is expressive, that person's an amiable, that person's an analytical, I need to bring them out.
So you address them according to their personality type.
Yes,
or you work with them.
And part of the system is to understand where your comfort zone is. I'm a driver, but I need to make other people comfortable in their style by being versatile. Versatile is a key word in the system. So, for example, Joanne, my wife, is an analytical, and analytical in decision making says no decision is better than the wrong decision. A driver says, "Oh, get real. Any decision is better than no decision. We can always make another decision down the road.
We can change directions."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And amiable, that's big on relationships, says, how will this decision affect my relationship with that person? Drivers should think about that, but they don't often. And an expressive says, will this decision be any fun, and will the future be grand? And by the way, is there a platform and a microphone, and how much time do I have to be up front? And so if you live your whole life thinking, why don't they just think like me because the way I think is the best? All of a sudden you look at these 4 different styles and you say, oh my. And most of the time, 75% of the people, because they're pretty evenly divided, 75% of the people are not real comfortable with your style. And so it was a huge wake-up call. So Joanne, I would call Joanne from the office before we understood social styles, and I'd say, okay, let's go out for dinner tonight, okay? She said, sure, sounds great. She didn't have to cook. So I get home, and we get in the car. I'm in the driveway. Should I go right or left down the street? I said, where do you want to go? Well, I'm still thinking. An analytical thinks because they don't want to make the wrong decision. And she's thinking, I thought she was just being content. Like, come on, I just want to eat. A driver just wants to make the decision and move on. And she's thinking about, well, what am I wearing? Will there be any leftovers? Maybe if there's leftovers, I don't have to cook tomorrow night. Am I on a diet? And it's just all these things go through an analytical's head. Well, then I figured it out. And so you've got to give them time and time. And among your staff, whether they're managers or entry level or interns, you've got to understand you're not managing you. You're managing all these people. And there's good books on all of this, on the 4 social styles. There's websites, there are videos, often very hilarious. But it was life-changing for me to understand this and to learn how to be versatile with other people. I had a guy, great friend, his name was Bob, that we worked with for many years, and Bob was very amiable, and oh my, if I'm going to be versatile with Bob, Bob's going to come in and he's going to say, John, how are you doing? How are the grandkids? Oh, that's a nice shirt you're wearing. And if I'm being versatile, I'm letting him do that. And I'm wanting to get to the agenda because I'm a driver, but I'm just letting him be comfortable with his style because he cares. He cares, and that's how he shows it. If I were running the meeting, I'd say, Bob, you're a couple minutes late, and we got a lot of things to do. We got 12 things, and let's get these things done, and, boom, 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 boom. And then at the end, oh, look, we still got 3 minutes. Bob, I heard your house burned down last night. How's the family? And so it takes, it's really hard. For the boards I work with, I try to help them understand. Do you know your board chair's social style? Do you know your CEO's social style? How are you making them comfortable? How do they act when they're under stress?
It's a whole different personality.
A whole different thing. A driver becomes even more controlling.
Very controlling, yeah.
And analytical avoids. Even though the Bible says you shouldn't go to bed without talking it through, an analytical can go to bed. That's how they get out of it. And amiable acquiesces. They'll just give in and they'll say they'll do it. They're not going to do it, but they're going to say they're going to do it. And an expressive attacks. And then, next hour they're still your best friend. So many times you can recognize their social style by how they deal with stress. So
now, you know what I'm thinking of as you're talking, because in older age, I'm finding I really am an amalgamation of all 4, and I think I had a psychologist tell me that as you get older and you start understanding yourself more, you see, I see, because I'm probably pretty much an analytical, but I have the driver's side to me. Yeah. I have the amiable. I can slip into that outfit really well, and I'm wondering if it isn't even more dastardly than that, and that when I'm thinking that other people, the mistake of thinking other people think like me.
Yeah.
You know what phrase they use a lot? Well, common sense will tell you.
Yes.
Well, it is common sense according to your type. According to you, that is common sense to you. But I have people that I work with, and I'm just saying it is not common.
Yeah.
Your thinking is not common sense.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm looking at our time, and I'm looking at my notes and realizing I'm not going to finish, but we're going to go 5 or 10 minutes more, Paul, and then we're going to do the other. Okay. Sorry, Paul, my producer is my timekeeper, and he's just giving me...
And we all love producers, don't we?
Yeah, I love producers. I love Paul Roberts. Are you kidding? He's Mr. Producer Paul. But I do want to talk, we'll kind of end this thing with just the philosophy of mistakes. And as I was thinking, as I read your book, and I did actually read the book.
Thank you.
And I hate to admit it to our listeners, but I don't always read every book, since I do a new book every week, and I have a sort of an aggressive reading schedule. But as I read your book, I was thinking about that mistake making in your definition, and as we go through more mistakes, it will become more clear, is that mistake making is as much about ignorance as it is anything else. Is that you don't know, it's the old entrepreneurial statement, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
Until you've experienced it, and then it's a mistake, but you didn't know it was a mistake because you thought it was a very productive idea and a good idea. And so frequently mistake making is about making decisions based on poor assumptions or inadequate assumptions, and lack of information gathering, which is really, you are key on that. And let's kind of wrap up this segment and talk to me about information gathering from books and seminars. And you read 100 books a year or some stupid crazy thing.
Yeah. Well, Charlie, far too late in life, I've always been a reader, but far too late in life, I figured out how I learn and how I retain information. And it's almost crazy. I've got a friend that wants to have lunch with me to talk about how I can remember and retain all this stuff. And I've had to kind of go deep to think that through. I think that there's first that decision, do I want to be a lifelong learner? Do I want to be teachable? And so at the end of every, whether it's a podcast or a Zoom call or a workshop or even watching a movie or a TV show, what's the takeaway here? What's learning? And is there somebody that you can talk about with that? That's why I did this thing in a workbook format, so that a team, whether you're 20 people or 3 people, you can take 10 minutes in your weekly staff meeting. I'm a big proponent of a weekly staff meeting, but not a boring one. I mean, just something that's alive, and just focus on one of these mistakes or a book, and have a couple of questions so you can walk away and say, and make it real. Tie it into something that happened recently in the office or in communications with the team, etc. So there are all kinds of different ways to learn. Peter Drucker said you got to figure out if you're a listener or a reader. My son Jason is a listener. He I can't tell you the last book he's read, but he's listened to tons of books. I'm a reader. I retain by reading and also writing in the blank pages in the front of a book.
Yeah, you have a brilliant methodology for taking notes in a book. I love it.
Well, I wish I had done it. I've got tons of books that don't have any writing in them that I should go back and read. Ken Blanchard, by the way, says you should probably read a book 3 or 4 times to really retain it. He's got a little book called No, K-N-O-W, No Can Do.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah,
that's nice.
About rereading 3 or 4 times.
Well, I'll tell you what, John, I can't wait to continue on next week. That we have, I feel like we're really going to get even in depth more, that we sort of gave everybody a broad brush overview of what you're all about and what mistakes are all about. But next week, I would like to focus a bit more on how we learn from mistakes, because you have made it clear in your book, you have made it clear that lifelong learning is an essential goal or objective in our lives, and that we never stop learning. And I concur completely. So we will focus on that a bunch more. But John, I am just so elated to get to first of all, just to get to talk to you, and that it gets recorded. Oh well, that's very cool.
That's right.
That's nice. I'll ask this a couple of times, and I'll put it in show notes. But if people want to get a hold of you, how is it what's the best way to
just the website, managementbuckets.com.
Not John Pearson.
No, managementbuckets.com. And they could sign up for my newsletter right on the homepage, or they can email me from there, and they can look at my blogs and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you are an anal. You're always productive.
That's right.
There is stuff that is going on that is very cool. Well, thank you for today, and I very much look forward to next week. And so I want to thank all our listeners for tuning into the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.